So thank you this evening. Thank you for being with us. We're going to discuss maps, but we are mostly going to discuss process and priorities. And the events of the last 2 weeks have raised lots of questions about process and priorities. And I'm going to start in a place that I don't normally start with, just a little bit of narrative. And then I'm going to hand off. I'll give you a brief preview of who's going to be speaking this evening. We have Pat Beaty, our legislative director. We have Amanda Holt, mapper extraordinaire. We have several other members of the Fair Districts mapping team, Anne Hanna and Michael Waxenberg. Justin Valaire will be joining us from Draw the Lines. Amy Rufo, our communications director, will be sharing some features that will help you to follow the drama, to compare maps, and to offer comment. But first, I do want to start with just a little narrative about where we are in this process. But 2 weeks ago, folks started telling me that they had tried to submit maps and the maps were not showing up. And in fact, some of them were trying to submit maps and weren't sure their maps were even being retained on the PARedistricting.com website. So I spent a Sunday afternoon, November 30th, drawing my own map to test this out on Dave's Redistricting app, because I looked at the app on the PARedistricting.com site and thought, I don't want to learn another app, and this looks very challenging and glitchy and not super helpful. So I drew it on Dave's Redistricting app on a Sunday afternoon. It was a rainy day, so I didn't mind spending the time. And the next morning, I went to upload it onto that site. It took about 2 hours to get my congressional map onto the site. And then I went to submit it and discovered I couldn't submit it. It said it was not validated, which when I looked around a bit, it was not validated because the population equivalence was the deviation in population was too large. What that means is the largest district, the distance between the largest district and the smallest district in terms of population was too large. It was well within the legal parameters that Dave's Redistricting app suggests. It was well within the legal parameters of any legal precedent I could find. And I could not find on the site any mention of what deviation would be allowed. So in frustration, I stopped and went back the next day and spent another several hours trying to get it to a point where I could submit it. I would get a little bit closer, try to submit, nope, a little closer, try to submit, nope. I got it down to about 160 people deviation between largest population and smallest, and finally got it validated and hit submit, and it vanished. Did not show up on the site at all. So the next day's activity, this was December 1st, that activity was to call Representative Seth Grove's office to say, I'm hearing from people who have submitted maps and they're not showing up. I have submitted my own map and it's not showing up. I wonder if anybody is looking at this site. Does anybody care that these maps are not showing up? Because my number was 172. That suggests that at least 172 people had tried to submit maps, but none of them were showing up. I was told that I needed to go back and enable comments, which seems a very odd thing to have to do, to have your map show up. But I did that. I went and enabled comments and it still didn't show up. So I called back to Representative Grove's office to say that I did enable comments. It did not show up. The next day, December 2nd, finally, maps began to show up on the site. The same day, Representative Grove announced that the deadline would be extended because the deadline was December 3rd. And at that point, there were about 10 maps that had finally shown up on that site. So the deadline was extended to December 6th. By December 6th, 5 o'clock, that was the deadline. And by December 6th, 5 o'clock, there were exactly 19 maps on that site. 2 days later, on December 8th, Representative Grove announced that he was introducing a map, one of the maps that had been submitted by December 6th. Now, I helped evaluate the maps submitted to our Fair Districts PA mapping contest this past summer. We allowed 3 weeks for maps to be submitted, and we took about a month to evaluate maps because there's a lot of work that goes into evaluating a map, thinking about the metrics, looking at what communities are harmed, trying to think through, does this really serve people well? It took us about a month consulting with quite a few redistricting experts here in Pennsylvania and some around the country to really think through those maps and to decide on the 5 best maps in each category. So the thought that somebody looked at 19 maps and within a day and a half had decided on the best map was a little perplexing. The next day, on December 9th, Amanda Holt, who is with us tonight, gave testimony on the map that had been selected, which was her map, and she'll talk about that a bit. I have to say I am in awe of Amanda's composure in the face of 2 hours of grilling over her map, and some of the questioning was rather condescending and some of it was rather bizarre, and Amanda kept her calm throughout it all. I am in awe. That was on December 9th. Also had been announced that there would be a voting meeting on December 13th, this past Monday. It became clear through the weekend that there were Republicans on the committee who did not support the map. And interestingly, on Monday, the map was not put to a vote. Instead, there were 2 bills put to a vote that did not have maps at all, that were congressional redistricting maps, but had no provisions for what those districts would be. They are ghost maps that give the public no information, placeholder maps meant to speed up the process, but also meant to bypass public review and scrutiny. That happened on Monday. Today, the 15th, there was a amended version of Amanda Holt's map that was voted on. The amendment was voted on, and the map was voted out of committee. So there's a lot of questions raised by that. The process, in terms of the map submission, the process in terms of the map selection, the process in terms of who amended that map between Monday and today, and a lot of questions about the priorities in the maps. Why was deviation a particular number on deviation? We still don't know what that exact number was, but it looked like they were going towards 0 population deviation, which will be discussed. And who decided that and why? There's lots of questions about process, lots of questions about priority. We're going to dig into some of those tonight. And the first person to help us begin digging is Pat Beaty. He is the Legislative Director for Fair Districts PA. He wrote bills for Governor Casey for years. He has watched the legislative process play out. He knows all the tricks of the trade and all the strange things that can happen. And he has done none of these himself, but he is an amazingly terrific advisor when we say, are they allowed to do that? And he says, oh yeah, and they do. So Pat, happy to have you talk with us this evening. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Carol. And you did a great job of summarizing all of the problems with the process that has been followed up to this point. I guess where I would start is to say that I think that we shouldn't be too surprised at where we are right now in this process, because it was really doomed from the start. They had an opportunity, of course, to consider our bill LACRA in the House committee and also in the Senate, which had some real process features to it that would have made all of what just happened, impossible. Or they would not have occurred, because the LACRA bill called for initial public hearings, which they did conduct. They were not the best public hearings you could have. They weren't live streamed. They were conducted at times when people were not available to participate, and so forth. But they did, give them some credit. They had 9 regional hearings to take testimony before producing a map, and even our bill called for that. We called for even fewer. I think it was 4. So we'll give them a little bit of credit for that. But after that, they received public comments through the website that Carol has described as being less than user friendly, and some people, I guess, were able to run the gauntlet and get their comments submitted, get their maps submitted to a partisan website, maintained by the House Republican Caucus, not by the House State Government Committee. Our bill, LACRA, said you have to have a website, and it has to be a committee website. They didn't do that. They decided to use a partisan website instead. So they receive all these public comments, and what happened to them? Did they use any of them? We don't see any evidence of that. They produced an amended map and talked about some criteria, some of which, were in the court decision from 2018. Those were mischaracterized, in my opinion. I can talk about that later, perhaps, but what we don't know very much at all about what criteria they thought were important, how they applied them, which ones they did not decide to follow. Did they really take any consideration, give any consideration to any public comment, other than, of course, we know they started with one of Amanda Holt's many maps. They chose that one, not sure why, but they chose that one and then decided to amend it. Why? We don't know. Why didn't they take anybody else's comments, or did they? Who knows? I mean, like just about everything else in life, it reminds me of a Seinfeld episode. If you remember, if anybody who used to watch Seinfeld, the episode where Jerry and Elaine are going to try to rent a car, and they walk up to the counter and say, the person says, "Do you have a reservation?" "Yes, I do." And she says, "Well, I don't have your car." And Jerry says, "Well, it's easy to take the reservation. You have to hold the reservation." Well, I think that's an analogous situation that we have here. It's easy to take public comment. You have to actually use it. You have to actually apply it when you're drawing the map, and we don't see the evidence of that. So where are we now? We are now at the point where they've put out a bill out of committee onto the floor. As it's amended, it has the new description of the what they're calling the preliminary map. And so now everyone is supposed to respond to that, to submit comments again to the same website if they're able to do that. And then what's going to happen? Then you're going to have a bill on the floor of the House where it can be amended theoretically. And so how are those comments going to be translated into amendments, or will they be at all? And is it up to every individual member to go into that website and find comments that they think are good ones and good suggestions, and then turn that into an amendment and try to offer it on the floor? It's absurd. It's a process that is, again, doomed to fail. So what really should happen, given where we are, given all the problems with the process up to this point, what should happen now is on January 4th, when they come back, the first thing the speaker should do is take House Bill 2146 off the table and refer it back to the House State Government Committee and say, okay, you got all those comments, now have a meeting, talk about them, talk about the bill, have public hearings on that amended bill. That's what should happen now. Will it happen? I don't think so, unless enough people really make that an issue and call for it to happen. So those are my comments on the process up to this point, Carol. If you want to discuss that any further, or I could, if you like, go into the discussion about equality of population.
Yeah, why don't you talk about population deviation, and we'll take questions on all of that later. But that's a great idea about one way to push back on this. Thank you.
Sure. Now, so this whole issue of equality of population for all the districts, I think, again, as I mentioned, it's one of a couple of things that were mischaracterized in the discussion in committee thus far. Equality of population is a goal. It is something that is supposed to be attempted by the legislature when they're drawing congressional districts, but it is not an absolute requirement, and the case law makes that clear. So I'll kind of cut to the most important case. There are a line of cases that talk about, one person, one vote, and what is required, and how close do you have to get to it, and under what circumstances can you deviate. But the most important case is the most recent one, which is the one in West Virginia, where the court said that, following an earlier case called DeKarcher versus Daggett, that first you have to try to achieve equality of population in all districts. And if someone challenges that and says that you didn't do that, or you didn't make a good faith attempt to reach equality of population, then the state, in a court case, has the opportunity to respond to that and say, we had to deviate from absolute equality of population in order to achieve one of our other legitimate objectives. And the courts have have given us examples, which is not an exhaustive list, but examples of what are legitimate objectives that a legislature may have other than equality, including making districts compact, respecting municipal boundaries, respecting the cores of prior districts, and avoiding contests between incumbents. So those are some of the ones that have been identified. But again, the courts have stressed that's not an exclusive or an exhaustive list. So the point being, if a legislature can demonstrate that they have other objectives that are legitimate, then they can justify deviations. And now the highest deviation that has been permitted or allowed by the U.S. Supreme Court is in that West Virginia case, and that was 0.79% from the average. Okay, so that, as Carol said, it's from you take the smallest deviation and the largest, and you take the average percent of the average district, which in that case, the deviation was 0.79%. And in that state, that was about 4,871 people. Okay, so when the House and the Senate too talk about deviations can't be more than a few, or they can't be more than 50, or they can't be more than this number or that number, that again is something that maybe should be a goal. It may be a criterion that they would like to pursue and to achieve, but it's not an absolute requirement. And again, deviations can be justified if you have other legitimate objectives. The equivalent, I'm certainly not advocating this, but in Pennsylvania, the equivalent of that 0.79% deviation would be, because of our difference in population and number of districts, would be approximately 6,000 people. I don't think anyone is suggesting that we go that far, but I'm only bringing this up to demonstrate that the requirement is not zero. It's somewhere between 0 and 6,000. And I would expect it would settle somewhere much closer to 0 than 6,000. But the point being, it's not an absolute requirement.
Thank you, Pat. And I will say a few things I should have made much more clear at the beginning. We are talking about congressional maps right now. We're not talking about state, House, and Senate maps. Those are done by the Legislative Reapportionment Commission. You may have heard tomorrow they will be voting on the state, House, and Senate map in the Legislative Reapportionment Commission meeting at 1 o'clock. We'll certainly be watching that on live stream. But tonight we're talking about congressional districts and the congressional districting process. I will say also that we will be sending a follow-up email, which will include lots of links. So links to proposed maps, links to ways to compare the maps, links to ways to offer comment. Pretty much everything you hear mentioned tonight, we will turn into an email and provide you with links. Last thing I want to say is, if you have a quick, easy question, you can put that in the chat. But if you have a larger substantive question that you want to have discussed, then you need to put it in the Q&A, and we will be taking questions from there in the order of those that have had the most votes up. So if there's a question there that you want to vote up, go ahead and do that. Otherwise, we'll just be taking them in the order that they were submitted. And just one quick question that was asked was, do we know what the deviation was that was required to submit maps, as I was describing my own little saga to submit maps? My map, as I began, it had a deviation of about 1,800. That was too big. I got it down below 300 and still could not submit it. I got it down to about 160, and then I was able to submit it. So that's about a 0.02% deviation. And the maps that were submitted all were 0.03 or under. So just a couple hundred people, much, much, much less than what Pat Beaty just described. And Amanda's going to tell us a bit more about her own saga with that wonderful website, and with population deviation and with drawing maps. Amanda was the lead plaintiff, the sole plaintiff in a successful, the first ever, I think, partisan gerrymandering lawsuit, certainly in Pennsylvania, but I think maybe nationally, in that she was able to show that the maps, the House and Senate maps provided in 2011 had far more splits to municipalities and counties than needed by drawing her own maps and demonstrating that, which forced for the first time ever, the Legislative Reapportionment Commission to actually draw new maps. The new maps they drew were not very much better, which Amanda pointed out in a subsequent appeal. But at that point, I don't know if you all realized, but the 2012 elections were held using the 2010 maps. And there was immediate litigation at the thought of that going on any further. And the court dismissed Amanda's second appeal. And we still have very gerrymandered maps, but imagine how much worse they would have been if it weren't for her successful case. So Amanda's going to tell us a little bit about her process, her priorities, and her thoughts on the process and priorities we have seen demonstrated so far. Thank you, Amanda, for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me. So happy to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so you can see. I was asked to talk about how do I actually go about drawing all these maps I keep churning out. So there's not a great deal of mystery in my mind to this, but for those who don't know what I do, here's a little glimpse. So I thought I'd start with this. This is how I draw a map. So I start with a blank map. Inside the map are percentages. So this is the percentage of the county's population that makes up a congressional district. So I have that for each county. And then I start grouping the counties together to make districts. And I add the percentages together to see if they're at like 100% in this case. And I'm counting the number of county splits that I'm making at this point. And I repeat. So I keep doing this over and over again, trying different ways. Like, what if I put these counties together? Or what if I put these counties together? I'm thinking about testimony I've heard and how different counties interact with each other, perhaps, and just seeing the different outcomes and how that impacts the rest of the state based on choices you make at a county level. And I can see from here in drawing my little circles all over this map and grouping the counties together, how many splits there would be at a county level and a fair idea of what the range is, the population range would be. So once I have several of these done, I'm ready to take it sort of to the next level. So then I'm checking the overall range and the estimated district populations. So I take those percentages that I have and I go in and I figure out how many people that translates to specifically. Because with congressional districts, there's a need for a little more precision than you find with legislative districts. So I am looking and seeing here an estimate of how, based on the configuration I came up with, what that's going to mean per district of what the various deviations would be in each district. So once I've done that, then I go on and I work to assign municipalities and the wards in Philadelphia to districts, because one of my priorities is to avoid dividing up places. So I'm always working to minimize that. So I'm working with the municipalities as a whole at this point, except for Philadelphia, where I use wards because Philadelphia is larger than a congressional district or two. And while I'm doing this, I'm watching that the districts are staying with the overall range that I had outlined. I'm looking out for non-contiguous municipalities and how that might impact it. I'm evaluating visual compactness. I'm referencing county maps to see where the municipal boundaries are, as well as school district boundaries. And there may be other things I look at, like roadways or rivers. I mean, these are all things that I'm sort of considering at this point as I'm working to balance the different priorities and try to accommodate everything in making the map within the parameters that I'm working in. So once I do that, then I go back and I look particularly at Philadelphia, but other areas of the state, to review how each district comes out with their voting age population, paying particular attention to the minority populations. And I am making adjustments as necessary, or I might go back to step one again, if you will, and try a different one going, oh, looks like I could maybe do something with minorities here, and maybe give them a stronger representation. What if I group the counties differently so that that could be accommodated? And then the results you can see here are different configurations you come out with as you try different things. They have different degrees of compactness, different degrees of population equality. All of these maps you're seeing here, none of them divide any municipalities except Philadelphia, because that was one thing I would not compromise on in my maps that were not at a 0 deviation. And they have varying degrees of school districts that were able to remain whole. So that just sort of gives you an idea of what, there's many different ways that you can come out to as you go through this process. So then one way I do to lower the overall range, because as Pat talked about that, while you can go up to 6,000 in theory, they kind of like you to stay closer to 0 if you can. So in congressional maps, when I'm looking at my overall range, and if I'm taking like one specific plan, I'll look at the lowest point of the plan, the district with the sort of lowest number, and the district with the highest number, and I go, is there a way I could configure this district differently to get to a lower number? Because those are the ones that are sort of causing my population to be higher. And I'll go back and maybe reconsider that. And so this is an illustration of how that might work, or how that did work in one instance. So the first map here, I'm starting at an overall range of 26 persons. And then I tried to take it down to 18 persons. So you can see like up here, I don't know if you can see my mouse moving at all, but like I had to change that area a little bit. Lancaster changed where the divisions were. I'm trying to think where else changed. I changed the configuration here along Butler County. You can see Washington County changed a little bit. And then I went down to 13 persons, and you can see that there are even further changes that happen. And you can see the map starts to grow less compact the lower you go. And you can see how compromises are made as you try to narrow this population down. And then finally you end up, if you go down to 0, so the first ones here, 26, 18, and 13, none of them divided any municipality. When I went to 0, you can see that compactness really was sacrificed quite a bit to get down. Even just going from 13 to 0, you can see a significant reduction in compactness. And the 0 one, I didn't divide any voting precincts, which is one thing that caused that. If you divide voting precincts, you can certainly have a greater degree of compactness. So that's just an example to illustrate how that works. But as was pointed out earlier, a 0 deviation is not required, contrary to what you may hear. And I just mentioned here that there are 12 states that have congressional districts with some population variance, and most include some split jurisdictions even. So even though they even though they have a population variance, they still contain county splits in their map in most instances, and most of them went unchallenged as well. So personally, my opinion is that when it comes to congressional redistricting, it's really important to be able to use some kind of population variance in your maps to be able to balance all the things that you should consider, like keeping the places we live together, like trying to create back districts, and making sure that they're contiguous, and respecting those places that we live, and to respect the Voting Rights Act too. And that becomes much more challenging when you end up going down to 0. So that is a very brief synopsis of how I go about drawing a map. And I can keep going on, Carol, but like I'm happy to leave it there and leave more time for questions later, or
let me ask you a couple of questions right now.
Sure.
So how did you deduce that zero population deviation was what was necessary? That's a question that, because many people who've been following this process, it didn't even occur to them that that would be an absolute requirement. Or there was a question about what amount of deviation was allowed. There was nothing anywhere that said that this was going to be a high requirement. And from what it looks like, I think 200 might have been the cutoff, because no, I don't see any map that had more than 200 from largest to smallest. So it looks like that might have been the cutoff, but there was no little message that popped up when we tried. I know this, I tried to submit, it said it wasn't validated because of deviation, but there was no little message that said, and here's the requirement. There was no, I went back and I looked at the web page, the portal, there was no message there about the requirement. So I'm curious, how did you deduce that zero was the goal? And then why did you decide on the specific map that you submitted? Because I know you have many, you have many. So how did
many more on paper that I never had time to like put into a program, as I'm sure other mappers here do too. I mean, there's papers strewn all over my house of maps. I mean, they just keep coming. So for the House portal specifically, I had no idea what population range they were using there. I will say that having worked on this issue for over 10 years, every time I've talked to any legislator about congressional redistricting, I tend to hear, oh, the districts have to be zero. And I'm like, really? Do they? Like, why do they have to be zero? So that caused me to start looking into this issue more closely. And even when I participated in the Governor's Redistricting Reform Commission, I would hear that comment as well, where people are under the impression that the districts had to be zero. And I kept saying, I'm not seeing it. Like, I mean, I know that that's an option, but I'm not seeing where that's a requirement that you have to, Pennsylvania is forced into that. And then more recently, in the House hearing that was held at the end of October, the testimony presented at that hearing seemed to be emphasizing and almost implying that maps would have to be at zero. And there appeared to be a great reluctance to consider anything other than zero. And so that kind of concerned me. And so I thought, well, I put a lot of maps forward that weren't at zero, but I better put at least one forward that is at zero, just to say, like, hey, here's an illustration that you can draw a map, because they kept saying you can't draw a map that doesn't divide any voting precincts. And I'm like, really? I think you can. And this is what it might look like. Not that it's necessarily the best map, because as we all see how other criteria has to be sacrificed to, get to zero and not divide any voting precinct. But it is possible. So don't tell me it's not possible, because it is possible. And no, you don't have to go to zero either. So the map I chose to go down to was just based on time. Like, I had a lot of different maps and I just kept working down. And then I decided, well, could I take this one that I had at 13? Because that was the closest one I had to zero. And I'm like, maybe that would be the easiest one to try to take all the way to zero. So that's why I chose to do that one and just show them the multitude of options of ways you can configure districts and still respect, the neutral criteria referenced in the Constitution.
Great. So really your goal was just to demonstrate that you could get to zero without splitting precincts, but you were not saying this is my best option. This is the one that takes into account people in Pennsylvania's deepest concerns for the maps. There was a question I will, so thank you, Amanda, and we will certainly be coming to you with more questions. There was a question that was asked, and let me just remind you, the questions that would be really good to discuss should go in the Q&A. You can put any answer in the Q&A, but the ones that are easy to answer, our panelists are answering them. So when you go to ask a question, the open questions there are the ones that we will likely be discussing, and you can vote those up if you feel like, yeah, I really want to hear the answer. There are also a bunch of answered questions in there, so you can take a look and look at the answered questions. Although if you're the kind of person who doesn't want to read and listen at the same time, ignore all of that and just listen to us. I know some of us like to read and listen and do multiple things at once, and others get very confused and would prefer not to. So all of that is good. There was a question I saw that I do want to pause on because I think it was answered in the Q&A, but I want to answer it here as well. Is it possible that they focus on zero deviation to give cover to splitting precincts or splitting communities in ways that allow for the kind of precise gerrymandering that we have seen in the past? And I will say, I am quite sure that that is part of what happens. And the whole split precinct thing is, I think there has been a narrative that, oh, well, you know, we have to make these splits because we've got to get to zero population deviation. So I'll give you another brief narrative. The first time I met with my then representative to raise the question of gerrymandering, she said, oh, gerrymandering is not a problem. And I said, well, I think it is. And you have, you know, when people split precincts to control outcomes of elections, that's really troubling. She said, there are no split precincts in Pennsylvania. I said, well, your House district actually has half of a precinct in Phoenixville. So Phoenixville is a nice town near me, a very compact town. It's not a big town. Phoenixville was split in half between two House districts in the last redistricting, and a polling place that I worked at was split in half, not for congressional House of Representative districts, for PA state House districts. That precinct was split. And when I brought that up, she said, oh, well, they had to do that for population equivalence. I'm quite sure it was, you know, the math, it had to be even, which again is for House and Senate, the population equivalent requirements are very different and much more relaxed. So I do think that legislators themselves are told it has to be zero deviation. And I think legislators are told sometimes we have to split precincts to get to zero deviation. And I think it's important we hold legislators, they need to do their homework and they can't just believe what leaders tell them. And we need to do our homework and make sure that they understand that zero population deviation is not essential. I'm going to share my screen for just a second because I just want to make visual something that both Amanda and Pat Beaty have said. Let me see if I can do this quickly. So what I'm sharing is just simply on the one side, it says the language from the lawsuit that people point to about what this is the original legal precedent. It says the overriding objective of drawing districts must be substantial equality of population among the various districts so that the vote of any citizen is approximately equal in weight. So those are words to remember. Substantial does not mean exact, and approximate also does not mean exact. And these are what Amanda was referencing, states that have more than one. If they have one congressional district, this is not a topic, but out of the 43 states that have more than one congressional district, 30 had zero deviation, and 12 or 13 had more than zero deviation. And you can see West Virginia, 4,871, but there's a whole bunch that were in the hundreds range without any question, without any problem at all, between 0.1 and 0.2%. And as I mentioned, I had to get mine down to 0.02% to get it on that website. And here I've shown you some of the notable maps that we looked at that were able to be submitted. They got down to 0.02%, which is quite a bit lower than a 0.1 or a 0.2%. So I'll stop my screen share there. We're going to hear from some other folks who are mappers about their experience. And Amanda did a good job of explaining the trade-offs. As you move towards zero population, you have to give up on not splitting things. You've got to give up on compactness. You've got to give up on really respecting what people have asked for to go after that one rather extreme arbitrary goal. And that we are arguing should not be the top goal. Districts should represent people. I also should say, I live in Exton in Chester County. We've had a huge housing boom in the last year. I drove around today taking pictures of new condo and apartment complexes in my zip code that will probably house about 4,000 people when they're all housed. So the idea of getting my district down to be exactly even when it already is thousands different from districts around it seems, as Representative Lou Schmidt said when he was grilling Amanda a week ago, people die, people are born, people move, and that's exactly right. So zero population is an odd thing to go after. We're going to hear from Anne Hanna. She's going to talk a little bit about some of her questions about procedure and process, her experience with mapping. We're going to hear from Michael Waxenberg, and then we'll hear from Justin Valaire. So Anne is a many-time winner for Draw the Lines. She also works with Concerned Citizens for Democracy, and she has been a mapping advisor and part of our Fair Districts PA Philadelphia team for a number of years.
Hello, everybody. Thanks all for being here. And first, I want to start by saying that I was very impressed by the way, the skill with which Amanda achieved the goals that her map intended to achieve. You know, her map prioritized avoiding splitting precincts while getting to that, as we've agreed, a little bit ridiculous, but that was what they asked for, +or-1 census population deviation. And so that was spectacular. Can everybody hear me, see me? My map just froze.
Yeah, let me just say, somebody's got their hand up. We're not actually going to answer questions that way. If you have a question, stick it in the Q&A, or if you have just a quick, easy question, you can put it in the chat, but we're not going to be looking at raised hands. We're going to be answering questions from Q&A, just so you know. But Anne, yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Sorry, like something just froze and I was concerned. Anyway, so I'm looking at my screen share. That's the problem. I'm actually looking at the screen share, but I'm looking at my own screen, I think. There we go. So this chart here is a little bit bigger version of the chart that Carol was just showing, comparing all of the sort of top four, the 4 ±0 population deviation maps that were submitted on the HSGC portal, and then also the amended version that the legislature has passed today, the 2018 map, and a couple other notable maps. And so the important thing here is that, you know, there are costs when you take one particular mapping value and you decide that, you know, you're going to extremize that mapping value and potentially let everything go by the wayside. And one sort of significant cost of the prioritizations that Amanda chose to make was compactness. If you look at this map, you know, she's assembling a puzzle of trying to get to these +or-1 without splitting any precincts. And it often takes some, you know, fairly odd shapes in some places to do this. And, you know, some of these kind of things are basically driven by the +or-1, as I understand it. And so if you look at her compactness score on this chart here, then you can see that her compactness score, these are the Dave's redistricting scores. Hers was 43, considerably lower than any of the other 3 maps that were submitted, the 69, 45, and 70. And that were +or-1 population deviation. And then similarly, and when the legislature tried to amend the map, this is the amended version of the map, one of the things that they tried to do was to improve the compactness, which they successfully did. You can see this map has a lot fewer jagged edges, but they also, you know, increased the split count to do so. Instead of splitting no precincts, they split 9 precincts in this map. And they also have a number of municipal splits. So this is just one example of the kinds of trade-offs that you make when you kind of prioritize one extreme value. And so the thing that the legislature did not do, or that the House State Government Committee, I should say, did not do at any point in the process, was tell us what the relative priorities were for these, you know, different, just even the 4 traditional neutral values of population equality, compactness, splits, and contiguity. And so, you know, Amanda picked this one very extreme version, this one direction. They chose her map out. They didn't tell us why they chose her map out, and didn't, you know, really look at anybody else's maps, apparently. And then they sacrificed the one thing that her map was very clearly doing, which was avoiding these splits. And so you know, it's very confusing as to why did they pick this map, and then why did they change it the way they did. We haven't really gotten any kind of clarity on that. And today's very rushed voting meeting did not provide that clarity either. And the unfortunate thing about this is, you know, there is one sort of obvious value that you can see in this chart that suggests one reason that it would be very easy to think is why they chose it, which is, if you look at the partisan stats, these last 2 columns over here, the higher numbers in this column are greater bias in favor of Republicans. And you can see that out of all the 4 maps, you know, this being her map, and then these other 3 being the other submitted ±1 population deviation maps, hers is by far the highest Republican vote bias in all of the maps. Now, Amanda, as I understand, does not look at this partisan information when she's drawing her maps, but it's very tempting to say, you know, did the Republicans who voted for this map almost unanimously cherry pick her one map and ignore everybody else's map because her one map happened accidentally to be the most favorable to them? And you can see that when they amended it, one thing that did not change very much was that strong partisan bias. It's still very strongly in their favor, even if slightly less so. And it's still a significant outlier relative to all the other maps. So, you know, as a citizen, you know, I don't want to assume that they have done this for partisan reasons, but it's hard not to wonder. And because they have not given us this explanation, you know, it's very concerning. It makes it very difficult for me, at least, to trust that the state legislature is doing its job in a fair and nonpartisan fashion. So I think that's probably my biggest concern is they have done this very rushed, very secretive process, and they just have not explained to us why they've done it this way. So other comments or questions at this point here?
We'll go on and we will circle back to take comments and questions. Michael, we're turning over to you to talk a little bit about your observations. There are some questions. I will pause here and say there are quite a few questions about specific points on the map, about why were specific things done, why are districts drawn in particular ways. And I think Amanda would say for her map, many of those decisions were based on numbers. In a way, it's a bit of like a Sudoku game where you've got to get the numbers to add up correctly. So a lot of decisions are made on simply getting those numbers to work out right. And the closer the deviation is, in other words, the smaller the allowed deviation, the more the numbers are really determining everything about where those district lines get drawn. So that's a piece of it. In terms of the amended version, it's hard to know what the rationale was, what the thinking was. And we're not going to spend a lot of time looking at specific points on the maps, but we will tell you at the end how to compare maps, how to look closely, and then how to offer your comment, because your comment will matter as they move forward in this process. So Michael Waxenberg is another of the Draw the Lines repeat winners. Michael was also an active mapper in our Fair Districts PA People's Map process. So he has had many community mapping conversations with folks all over the state and has heard the angst and the concerns and the heart of people who just want districts that make sense for their communities. Michael, and I think Anne, did you draw maps for the Princeton gerrymandering team? Michael also has drawn maps for the Princeton gerrymandering team. He's been doing lots and lots of mapping, and he apparently maps all day long, even though he does hold a full-time job. We won't tell his employers this. So Michael's going to give us a few of his thoughts on how this is going and priorities and process. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks very much, Carol. And I think I shared my screen a little prematurely. I hope I didn't make you disappear behind the curtain there. We do have a few more maps just to show as examples and to illustrate some of the trade-offs involved. But first, I want to echo something that Anne said earlier, which is that what Amanda managed to achieve is something really impressive. And, mappers all over Pennsylvania are sort of agog at her ability to create a zero dev map with no precinct splits at all. And I actually reached out to her and asked, well, isn't it impossible to change this map? Because you'd spoil it. You would have to split precincts to stay at zero deviation. And she said, no, I've got a few like that. We can make changes and I'll get it back to no precinct splits. So I'm in awe, and there's nobody like Amanda. But to look at a few other people's works and the trade-offs that they've had to make, what you've got in front of you is a map that was drawn by one of our ace mappers, Ruth Yeiser. And there were a couple of motivations here. One was just sheer competitiveness. I think Ruth wanted to show that she could beat Amanda at her own game. And since Amanda had split 14 counties, Ruth was determined to get down to 13 split counties, and she did it. But there's also a practical reason for doing this. Once you know that there's a leader in the clubhouse, and in this case, it was a 14 county split map, there's a necessity to demonstrate that that's not the absolute best you can do, because politicians may exploit that attribute to make it appear that that map really stands out and is unique. So Ruth got to 13 split counties, but as you can see, like Amanda's original map, she made some sacrifices along the way. And if you look at Westmoreland County, Venango with the spider web reaching out, Adams County, Lancaster, even poor little Montour, you see that these counties have been split into multiple pieces. There's a loophole in the way we count splits. You can cut, for example, Westmoreland into 4 pieces, but that only counts as one split because they're divided between 2 counties. I won't go into a lot of depth, but just to demonstrate the fact that these traditional values can work against each other. I'm going to close that one. I'm going to go to another map drawn by none other than Carol Kuniholm. And this illustrates a really interesting trade-off. And to show it to you, I'm going to zoom in on Philadelphia. Carol set out to maximize opportunities for minority representation, and she did something really remarkable. Most congressional maps of Pennsylvania feature one Black majority district and one coalition majority minority district. Carol managed to eke 3 majority minority districts out of Philadelphia and Delaware counties. And that's terrific. And the DRA minority representation score reflects it. It's sky high. It towers over the rest of the mapper's efforts. But here's the challenge with this map. Interestingly, the trade-off here is minority representation versus potentially minority representation. Because in order to get that 3rd majority minority district, which is a coalition district of different minorities, she had to sacrifice the 1 majority Black district. And that would be a very controversial choice, particularly for the Philadelphia Democrats and for one particular congressman potentially. So again, not only is there tension among priorities, there can be tension within priorities. I'm just going to bring up one more. And I promise there's an important lesson here. I am not showing one of my maps to toot my own horn. I'm going to bring it up here to demonstrate a very specific point, and I think I just hit it, but that wasn't intentional because I do want to show it to you. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Basically, what I did here was I took the Draw the Line Citizens map and I tried to bring it into alignment with the partisan lean of the current congressional map, because the Draw the Line Citizens map is terrific and it's in many senses fair, but it does lean more Republican than the current congressional map. So I just wanted to achieve alignment so that if my map ever went in front of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, we could say, well, it doesn't really lean either way. It just leans as much as your map does. I won't go into a lot of detail about how that was achieved, but I'm going to use this map to share a little secret with you. To determine the partisan lean of a Pennsylvania congressional map, you do not need data. You do not need voting patterns. You don't need to know who's registered or where they live. All you need to do is look at a few key inflection points on that map. One of them is Allegheny County. Specifically, what you look for there is whether Pittsburgh is grouped together with its very blue eastern suburbs. If it is, that's a red-leaning map, or at least that portion of it is. I'll point out a few other inflection points. In south central Pennsylvania, you look to see whether Harrisburg has been grouped with either York City or Lancaster City. If you want to lean blue, you've got to group it with both. If you want to be somewhat competitive, you group it with one and also with the near suburbs in Cumberland County. A few others, Chester County, does it get Reading as part of its district? Bucks County, what part of the blue or adjacent counties does it get joined with? And northeastern Pennsylvania, how is Luzerne divided? If it's divided along the Wyoming Valley from northeast to southwest, that's going to give the Democrats a chance. If you divide Luzerne any other way or draw the Northeast any other way, that district is going to lean red. Potentially the Lehigh Valley, depending on how the other districts are drawn, that might be an inflection point. But I'm telling you, when politicians say we didn't look at partisan data, well, it's true about Amanda. She never looks at partisan data. It's probably true about the politicians and their staffs too. They don't need to look at political data or partisan data. All they need to do is look at those inflection points and they know which way that map will lean. I'll leave you with that bit of humble wisdom, and I'll hand off, I hope, to Justin. Has Justin joined us yet, Carol?
I don't know. Amy, have you?
I'm here.
Justin's there.
Oh, excellent, Justin. So let me introduce Justin Valaire. Some of you may know him, probably most of you know him. He is the coordinator, the director for the Draw the Lines project. He was the one who had his hand on the map to draw the Lines citizens map, which was also submitted on that portal that we've been talking about, which also had a 0 population deviation, had good metrics on lots of things. And you would think if you're going to say, hey, we chose a citizens map, honestly, I would have thought that would be the citizens map you would choose, because his work represented the work of thousands of mappers across the past 3 years. Amanda was actually part of the Draw the Lines project as one of their advisors or judges or directors. I'm not quite sure which, but it is puzzling that with all the fanfare about, hey, we chose a citizens map, the one that actually was introduced as a citizens map with input from many, many citizens was not the map that was selected. So I want to hear from we're going to hear from Justin, just his thoughts on the how the process and procedure and priorities have worked out, and what Draw the Lines is thinking with regard to this whole process. Justin.
Pleasure to be with you all tonight. The Committee of 70, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization based out of Philadelphia, but we're statewide, and we've been running this Draw the Lines project for almost 4 years now. And like Carol said, we took all the maps that we collected through our competitions and put them into the citizens map. And Carol said it perfectly. This was something that over 1,500 completed maps and over 7,200 people contributed to. And so we, would have like to have seen that given some consideration. I know the whispers out of the Senate indicate that there's been some use of the citizens map in their map drawing, which we're encouraged by. We just heard this afternoon some of the just to peek behind the curtain, some of the conversations among the Senate State Government Committee and their staff had previously indicated that they were going to produce a map at the end of this week. That is no longer the case. They're looking at next week, most likely because of they're waiting for the LRC to produce their maps for the State House and Senate tomorrow. And then they'll wait to produce something from the Senate, hopefully next week. I mean, we should be seeing something soon here. I don't know if it's been discussed yet this evening. Apologies for joining late, but just to kind of give you a preview of what Draw the Lines is talking about, I think this is going to be relatively consistent among a lot of the advocates, is that we still need to have a lot of time to view these maps. Like what we saw today coming out of the House State Government Committee, like this map, we only just now had access to the shapefile. We saw the map for the first time yesterday. And so we still need 30 days. 30 days is given in the Constitution for the legislative maps. And so we need to see that same consistent process to the congressional map as well. Even if it's not required by statute, this is a practice that in reality should be doable. And we would hope that that's going to be something that's taken seriously by both the House and the Senate. So they're obviously going to have to merge their two maps, the House map that came out today, and then whatever's coming out of the Senate. So we'll see how that process works, but we would hope that they are going to create a more friendly website that encourages a lot more participation than what we've seen from the previous House website. I know a number of you probably tried to submit a congressional map to that and were stymied or had difficulty. So hopefully we can see something that's better. One thing that we did hear as well is that the Senate is thinking, this is no guarantee by no means, that they would like to produce a few maps with a few different options, possibly one with 0 population deviation and no precinct splits, maybe one with a little larger population deviation. Again, that's just, that's a possibility right now. But if you are speaking with anybody on the Senate State Government Committee, we would encourage you to tell them that's a good idea. Let's see several options, and more importantly, create a way for the public to provide quality comment to that. So right now, there's a whole lot of different ways that you can contribute to. There's the governor's portal that closed today. There's the House State Government portal they had up if the Senate comes up with something. So we need these people to start working together and creating a consistent way for you all to share your feedback on this. So the thoughts right now are a little scattershot just because there's so many different pieces of information that are coming from a lot of different sources. So to kind of sum it up and wrap things up, we would like to see, and we can continue to share this with each of your legislators, we want to see a consistent process. We want to see a process that has some time involved in it. We don't want this thing to rush through first week that we're back after the new year. We've still got over a month of this, and some of us are going to take some time, hopefully over the holidays, but if these maps come out, we all need a long time to review them. So that's largely what Draw the Lines is going to be focused on. Next week at 11 o'clock, we are going to have a media advisory or a media event, which will reflect something we just did this Monday, where a number of our citizen mappers go through the actual draft map and comment on what looks good, what could be improved. So we're going to do that this next Monday. It'll be on our Facebook page on Draw the Lines PA, where we're going to look at the House State Government map. So we would invite you all to check in on that and kind of give you a preview of how our citizen mappers, these are mappers who have won competitions with Draw the Lines in the past. So they're really good at this. They come from all over the state, have a range of backgrounds and political ideas. And so, but they're all focused on a good, fair, transparent mapping process. So check that out. But otherwise, just stay tuned to either us or the Fair Districts team for news that's coming out. So Carol, thank you for having me tonight.
Sure. Thank you, Justin, for your work. And just I will promote again Monday, if you want to look at the map, the currently proposed map, much more detail. That would be great to follow on the Draw the Lines Facebook live stream. One of the issues that we have is we don't really know what the actual map will be. So we've already spent a lot of time analyzing Amanda's map, and then that's not the map. We could spend a lot of time analyzing the map that came out today. Is that going to be the map? We are likely to see quite a few more maps, and in a way, it's almost there's been a lot that has been confusing in this process. There was an exchange today in the voting meeting between Representative Grove and Representative Conklin Representative Madden, I believe, who was saying, both Representative Conklin and Representative Madden had said we weren't included. We did not participate. We did not have any say in the selection of the map. And Representative Grove said, well, why don't you create your own website and invite your own maps? And it's like, that's really not the point. We are going to have to end up with one congressional map. And it's been exhausting to have the Senate State Government Committee do its own hearing process. They've never given a portal to offer comment. It's been hard to figure out how to offer comment on that side. And then the House portal, it's hard to find. It's not linked to from the House State Government Committee on the General Assembly website. You have to know it's there. You've got to go to the House PA GOP website to find it. And then we have the Legislative Reapportionment Commission site. And then we have the Governor's Redistricting Advisory Council site, which has over 100 maps have been submitted there and lots of comments. So there's lots of places to submit. It's confusing and it's hard to know what's the real process. And as Justin said, what we're really asking for is tell us what the process is and to tell us what the priorities are, because it's hard to engage, as people found trying to submit maps, when it's not clear who decided the priorities. And there are no priorities in Pennsylvania law. There's nothing in Pennsylvania law about the process or the priorities for the way that congressional district maps are drawn. I've seen a few comments about partisan bias questions, about competitiveness questions. And when we started, we were very committed to the idea of a independent citizens commission that is data blind when it draws the maps. But if the legislators are doing it, it is not, as Michael pointed out, it's not possible to have it be data blind, which means that people are making decisions that have partisan impacts. And if that's the case, it's essential that the maps reflect the partisan makeup of the state and not be drawn to give undue advantage to one party or the other. So that has to be something that's looked at. And it's something that the state Supreme Court looked at when the League lawsuit was decided back in 2018. Anne has her hand up. Anne, were you going to add a comment on some of that?
Yeah, since I was, I think, the one who raised that issue the most strongly, I just want to add a little bit more to your already excellent points on this, which is if we don't pay attention to the partisan impacts of the maps proposed by the legislature, we cannot know if they are gerrymandering or not in favor of their partisan interests. This is how we defend ourselves from partisans trying to manipulate this process, is that we actually look at the data that they are absolutely 100%, no matter what they say, looking at behind closed doors to decide which maps are best for them. So we do ourselves no favors if we blind ourselves to the data that they are using.
Thank you. And panelists, please feel free to raise your hands to jump in. I'm going to move through the top, the questions that have been voted up. Amy, if you see something that I'm missing, please jump in here and make sure that we don't miss important questions. And the first one was, do you think the legislature wants to force a very low population deviation because it would be an excellent excuse to allow them to play the kind of games they like to play when it comes to redistricting? I talked about that a bit before, and that the narrative that's been given to our legislators is, oh, it has to be that way. That's what's required. And then we have to split precincts. And it is very much the case that those strange lines, trying to get zero deviation does create those kinds of strange lines, which then can give cover for bad behavior in terms of trying to manipulate the process and have it turn out for one party or the other, which is why it's really important to look at partisan bias. It's really important to push back on the zero deviation. And it's really, really important that the legislature clarify what the priorities are, what are the values that are governing this. Minimizing splits works hard against compactness, and voters tend to say, well, we don't want districts that wander all the way across the state. It would be really valuable to say we are holding those in equal tension, which is what we tried to do in the bill that Pat Beaty talked about at the beginning. The LACRA bill that we talked about would have clarified what the priorities are and made them equivalent, made some of them equivalent and made some of them secondary. And it's really important that the legislature be transparent. That's a word they like to use, but they have been completely lacking in transparency about what the priorities are that they are using as they think about drawing the lines. Does anybody else want to jump in on that? Otherwise, we're going to move on to the next question. How feasible is it to draw a map that reflects the percentage of the two major political parties? At this point, Democrats still outnumber Republicans. How feasible is it to have more competitive districts? I will say it's hard to draw a map that gives advantage to Democrats. It is not so hard to get a map that comes close to balancing the two parties. And it is hard to draw competitive districts in a state where so many people live in very red areas or very blue. But I think we saw many, many maps that were able to get almost a third of the districts competitive. And that would be a really good goal to say if a third of our districts were close to competitive, that would really change the tone of our whole electoral system. And that would be an important goal. And I think it's something that should be held as a priority. Anybody else want to jump in on those questions? I'm going to keep moving. If the legislature and the governor cannot agree on a map, will the state Supreme Court be tasked with drawing the map? Yeah, if the legislature doesn't get it done, if they get it done and the governor says, I can't sign off, I'm going to veto it, then Pat Beaty, it would be great if you would jump in here and tell us a little bit in terms of the legal timeframe of how this plays out.
Sure, and I think that most people expect that if they do not agree or if the governor vetoes a map that comes to his desk, that it will go to the state Supreme Court. And that's, I would say that's likely, but there's nothing really that in law or the Constitution that says that that's what happens. It has happened in the past, and again, I would say it's probably likely. And there is a case already filed and sitting in the Commonwealth Court, which could be used for that purpose to accelerate the review of, or to take over if they have taken too long to draw a map, or if the governor has vetoed their map and someone goes to court. So first, and if they should fail, or if the court should not take it up, which I can't really conceive of, but if they did not and no federal court stepped in, then there's a big question about what happens next. The federal law seems to say that all the candidates for congressional office would run statewide without running in specific geographic districts. Some people say that law is no longer in effect or in force, but that's an open question, at least in my mind. But yes, it will probably go to the state Supreme Court. Nothing says that that has to happen.
Thank you, Pat. Next question: is anyone advising the media as to the legislature's lack of transparency and rigor so the public is made aware of the lack of fairness in the process? Yes, there are some answers about some members of the press who are doing a really terrific job. I will say my little saga in trying to get my map online, I very deliberately took screenshots all along the way and posted on Twitter as I was going along. And I got a call from a reporter who follows me on Twitter to say, I am following this story. And where are you now in terms of getting your map submitted? And I explained where I was. That reporter called Representative Grove's office to say, I'm curious. And actually, I don't know if it was my call or we had a couple other folks from Fair Districts who called, or if it was the reporter's call. But shortly after those calls, all those maps began appearing. Obviously, no one in their office had bothered to look at that site since it was posted months earlier. No one had looked to see that there were no maps visible, but a reporter did call, and there are certainly reporters following us. I would say too, though, that all of you should be writing letters to the editor and should be contacting legislators to express concern and to call attention to how this is all playing out. So if any of you tried to post a map and were not able to, sending a letter to Representative Grove's office and sending a letter to the editor would be a good thing to do. And it's really important for all of us to play a role in keeping attention on this process. And that's one way to do it. The preliminary map has only been passed by the House State Government Committee. The full House will not vote till January 4th. We're not sure that they'll vote even then. There's a bit of a process, as Pat explained earlier. The Senate State Government Committee has yet to pass any map, let alone what the Senate will pass. When will comment period start? Right now. What is considered the actual preliminary map? Well, the one that was passed out of the House State Government Committee is the House preliminary map. But as Justin mentioned, there is a rumored map that Senators Argyle and Street are working on together. That might be voted in committee next week. We'll know after it's voted in committee. But to remind you, Pat said it would be great if the preliminary map went back to committee. And actually, it would be great if both preliminary maps were in committee, if they were discussing them in committee, if the committees would talk to each other, which apparently they have not done yet. And if the committees together would negotiate a good map, and if they would include the governor, that was something that Representative Conklin was talking about, that this has to be a bipartisan product or it will not get passed. And yet we're not seeing any evidence at all to date of working between the two chambers or working between the two parties, which is unfortunate. Anybody else want to jump in on that? I don't have to answer all these questions myself, I hope. Does the governor have to agree on both congressional and legislative maps? I will answer this one. It's an easy one. The governor has to sign the congressional map or veto it. The Legislative Reapportionment Commission has complete say, unless it gets appealed to the court, of the House and Senate maps, and we will see their preliminary maps tomorrow. The Legislative Reapportionment Commission has authority over that. The governor has nothing to say about the House and Senate maps. Some states like North Carolina and Texas have requirements for fairness when it comes to partisan divides. Pennsylvania has no requirements of any kind in law for congressional maps, nothing. It doesn't put any requirements in terms of what our priorities are about partisan fairness or compactness. Nothing about process, nothing about priorities. We have tried very, very hard for the last 5 years to get laws in place that would govern the process. And hopefully after this round, perhaps some of our legislators will say, you know what, let's not do this again. Let's get some rules into law so that we have some clarity about what we're doing going forward. There's some questions, and I'm not going to go into why questions about the map. There are some answers Amanda has answered in chat, but I don't want to go into looking at specific parts of the map. Did Representative Grove make the minor alterations to the Holt map? And what do we know about the minor alterations? The truth is we don't know who is doing mapping. I'm assuming it's not Representative Grove. I'm assuming it's a staffer. Have members of the committee weighed in? This doesn't sound like there's been much discussion. Are there others in leadership who have weighed in? We don't really know. And I have to be honest, cynicism is an occupational hazard in this work that we're doing. And is it possible that they're going to show us maps, get us commenting on the maps, get us all upset about the maps, do this repeatedly, and then at the last minute, give us the map that they've had ready to go all along that might look very sweet and pretty, but might actually be a stealth gerrymander that accomplishes purposes that they have never disclosed, and say, here it is, we listened to all your comments, we've got a great map, we're good to go. That could easily happen. And that's part of why we need metrics and we need time, and we need to know this is the map that we are proposing, and the public needs to have time to review and analyze it rather than just have it pushed through at the last minute. We don't know if that will happen, but we'll certainly be asking to make sure that we have time to review. Anybody want to jump in on that one? Anne.
Yes, please. And in fact, I'm going to share my screen here just for a second real quick, assuming my computer will cooperate. So the thing is, the minor alterations that that were supposedly made to Amanda's original map were not actually all that minor. They were cleaning up a bunch of jaggedy edges in a bunch of places. They were apparently addressing, and the reason for the jaggedy edges, of course, was getting to plus or minus 1 person population equality with 0 precinct splits. And so when they cleaned up those jaggedy edges, they sacrificed the major achievement of that map, which was to have the 0 precinct splits. They ended up splitting 9 precincts instead. So that was already just conceptually a very big change in the map. And then the second thing that they did, that they accomplished at least, and perhaps I'm not gonna be able to actually share this, is that they cleaned up these jaggedy edges, they improved the compactness quite a bit, which was a good change, I think. But then they also cleaned up a particular pain point for a couple of Republican legislators who had initially voted against the map, which was a significant split in Lebanon County. And so that, won them 2 more votes in favor of advancing that map. And a more subtle change was, I did notice that one of the changes in the map moved incumbent Congressman Guy Reschenthaler from a leaning Republican district near Pittsburgh to a strong Republican district near Pittsburgh, which is itself is also kind of, maybe that wasn't on purpose, but it is kind of an interesting question, is did he have input into that as well? But they did not make changes that were requested by a lot of people commenting on the map, including they did not remove the fairly damaging split of Wilkes-Barre, I don't actually know how you pronounce that. I apologize. They did not remove the very damaging split of the Harrisburg region into 3 different districts. And they did not relieve the pretty severe packing of Pittsburgh. When you put Pittsburgh into only 1 congressional district, basically you pack all the Democrats in that region into 1 district and ensure that Democrats can only win 1 district in this region, even though there are plenty of Democrats in that Pittsburgh region enough to easily win 2 districts. So it's a deliberate, you could argue about whether or not that's good or bad, but it is a partisan choice. And many people did ask them to make the opposite choice and, have a more less biased districts in that region. So, they made dramatic changes, but the changes they didn't make were also fairly dramatic and meaningful.
Thank you, Anne. We're gonna, there are lots and lots of questions. We can't possibly get to all of the questions. Let me just say one thing about some places tend to get split more than others, and those tend to be fairly densely populated areas that are surrounded by less populated areas. because a place like Luzerne County has a pretty high population. The counties around it, especially north and west and even northeast, smaller populations. And so to get to the population needed for a district, sometimes you end up splitting those more densely populated areas. So places like Center County, Luzerne County, Dauphin, Cumberland, those might end up getting split more often. And again, you're balancing priorities, because number one, you don't want to split communities, but number two, you also want compact districts. So if you're trying to keep Luzerne intact, you could end up with a district that wanders way around it and really stretches far. The more density you can get into it, the smaller the district can be. So you're really balancing a lot of priorities, and communities can weigh in on that. But the mappers also are, they've got numbers and they're trying to work their way through the numbers. So sometimes that's what happens. Sometimes it's done for devious reasons, and sometimes it's done just to try to say, I understand that people get really disturbed when you've got these districts that wander too far. Let's find a way to keep them a bit more compact. I want to pause now and shift gears. Amy Rufo is going to tell us a little bit about how you can look more closely at maps. We will be putting all proposed maps into Dave's redistricting app so that you can look at them more closely. The platforms we're seeing them in are not helpful. And sometimes that takes quite a bit of work by people like Anne and Michael and Ruth Yeiser, our other mapper extraordinaire, who take legal language and transform it into maps, or take weird PDFs and transform them into Dave's redistricting apps. So we will be doing that. But Amy's going to tell us a little bit about how you can see maps, compare maps, and also offer comment. So Amy.
Okay, thanks. Give me a second. I'm going to share my screen. So I think you should see my screen where I'm showing you our home page. And if you scroll down to this section called Redistricting 2021 Updates and click on the link Compare Maps, let's see if it works. If you scroll down and select your county, so I live in Lancaster County, so I'm going to select Lancaster. Right now, this is a very quick view of my county. It's showing the current house maps. You can see that by these two radio buttons. If I switch to the FDPA map source, this is our people's map. And we are hopefully soon going to have the Legislative Reapportionment Commission's proposed map that will also be there. You can also look at the Senate. So that's the FBA. That's our people's map and the current districts. And then if you want to see something a little bit more detailed, you can click on this interactive map feature. Is that coming up correctly? Seeing okay, so this is like a Google Maps view, and you can turn on different layers. So you could put on the current house map, and then I could see which municipalities are in which districts, how they're divided. So for instance, in Lancaster County, I can see that this municipality is divided, has 4 different representatives. You can also click on your school district boundaries to see your school district boundaries. And then you could look at the proposed house maps, and again, switch between the school district and the municipality districts. The other thing that's on this compare maps page is if you can compare maps at the district level. So this is not we're going to go to a different website, Redistricting in You. And this will allow you to look at the congressional districts, and it'll allow you to compare the current district to the, in this case, the Draw the Lines PA Citizens Map, or the current House districts, and Fair Districts People's Proposed Map for Senate and House. This is a little bit more of a clunky tool. So if you zoom in, and let's go to Lancaster again. And I live kind of around here. So I'm gonna I clicked on that port, and now it shows me, I can look at the congressional districts, which is much larger. So you have to zoom back out. And then you use this little slider bar that'll show you in the purple line That's the Fair Districts PA, I'm sorry, that's the Draw the Lines Congressional District proposal for this area. And if you slide it back farther, the black line shows you what the current district is. It's a little clunky, but it works.
You show that the Amanda's map is also on there. If you click where it says Citizens District over on the
Oh,
right, yeah, click click that.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And they will be
excellent.
as quickly as they can. Any proposed maps, the folks at City University of New York are working on this, and any proposed maps will be put there.
Oh, look at that. That's great.
And can compare them, and then you can look at data for those districts. They got the Amanda's map up there within a day, and I'm sure they are paying attention, and we'll have the new proposed map up, and Amanda's taken down within the next day or so. So there's plenty of folks working hard to help you be able to look at maps. And as I said, the maps will be loaded into Dave's redistricting app, and we will be sharing those links. Our Amy is in charge of our communications team. She keeps our website up to date. We will be doing some work to get everything in one place so people can review and offer comment. And there is a page on a website that shows where to offer comment, but that will be being updated too. Anne, did you have your hand up? I think not.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was just going to say that I do think the map is actually already, the current map is actually already there. I think I just looked and it was there. I could be wrong.
On that
new
sharing
proposal.
one?
On
Exactly.
the redistricting and you map, yes, the new preliminary map is already there. It's called Updated Preliminary Plan.
Amazing. They're very quick. So
Yeah, I mean, do folks want me? I can also share my screen for how you comment on the map. Do you? Is that?
I don't think so.
Okay.
We will share links. We will share links for how to find things. And there will be lots of analysis. We will share links. We will try to keep the website up to date. As you can tell, this is a quickly moving landscape. A lot's been going on. It's not settled down yet. As we said, the Senate might have a proposed map out next week. And certainly tomorrow, we will have preliminary maps from the Legislative Reapportionment Commission. So the next few days will be busy, but I do think then it will quiet down over the holidays. But we want to keep a little bit of pressure on even through that. So take a day sometime during your break to look at maps, to offer comment, if you feel so moved, to write a letter to the editor. What we want to do is just keep saying we need a better process. We need more clarity about the priorities, and we want good maps. This time, this decade, we want maps that represent all of us really well. And so for you, in your county, in your district, where you live, it's important for you to be calling attention to what matters to you. And the more that they hear from us, the more likely it is that we end up with maps that represent us all well. So it shouldn't be this hard. It shouldn't be this confusing. It shouldn't be this complicated, but that's what we have this year. And thank you all for your work in helping get better maps for the next decade. This matters a lot. And as I said, we will be sending you an email with links. This video will be posted to YouTube. I think we could pull the chat into a document and share a link to the chat with folks, because there's a lot of good, and I think we could probably share the Q&A as well. Is that possible, Amy, do you think?
I think so.
Yeah, so we'll share as much of this as we can, because there's a lot of really, really terrific questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all your questions. There are a lot of really good questions in the Q&A. And thank you, panelists, for all your work answering those questions as the evening has gone on. Really, really appreciate that folks are paying so much attention. I think I've said this before, but I'll say it again. When I first got involved in this, people said, I had one guy who called and said, "You're wasting your life." He called me several times to say, "You're wasting your life. Leaders will never give up power. We don't have initiative and referendum, and people will never pay attention." And thank you all for proving him wrong. People are paying attention. We have to continue paying attention, and we do expect to get better maps this time around. So thank you for being with us tonight, and keep paying attention. We are definitely not done.